Welcome to Two Truths, where we explore controversial topics within religion, philosophy, and history from at least two different perspectives. I'm Dr. Darren Iammarino, and for today's topic, we're going to be looking at ancient Egyptian pyramids, burial practices, tombs, and afterlife beliefs. As is typically the case, we'll start chronologically and look at the prehistoric period first and move our way step by step as we get up into the pyramids and beyond. So, going back to this prehistoric era in ancient Egypt, that would put us on a timeline before 3100 BCE. At this early period, you really are dealing with much simpler burial practices, so a pit grave with some simple grave goods that the deceased might have enjoyed in life, right? And they're trying to take it into the next life. They also might be situated in a fetal position, facing west, right, towards the setting sun. Simple ideas that definitely show, though, the beginning of a belief in a sort of regeneration, resurrection, rebirth theme, which will continue on, especially for those at the top, mainly the Pharaoh. So that's a little bit on the pre-dynastic period. Once you get into the early dynasties, so the First Dynasty and into the second, things start to change quite dramatically, dynasty to dynasty. So in the First Dynasty, you're still going to have these underground tombs, which is a general pattern. Honestly, as you move through all the periods, there's going to be a substructure tomb and then a superstructure above, often, right? But in this First Dynasty, we're mainly dealing with a subterranean situation, and you're not dealing with very massive tombs like you might get later. Another bizarre practice that may have existed in the First Dynasty was burying servants with the Pharaoh. So that probably wasn't the most popular practice if you're not dead yet, right? And the Pharaoh dies before you and you're buried either alive in this tomb with him or killed and put in the tomb with him. Either way, you can guess that wasn't terribly popular. So one thing that will develop and then become very popular throughout the long history of ancient Egypt are these items known as shabtis. I actually have one behind me here. This is a real one. You can barely see it, most likely, but they're about 5 inches, 6 inches maybe, most of them, and they're a substitute, a stand-in, servants for, the deceased, so that they can enjoy their afterlife and not be constantly bothered by requests and things. Right? So that's a practice that will develop and become very popular, a lot more popular than burying people alive or something like that. So as we move from the First Dynasty into the Second and then to the Third, there's going to be some major shifts again. The Second Dynasty, you're going to really get these mastabas. This is like a one-story house, basically. Think of a big rectangle, and there will still be these subterranean aspects where you're going to get more and more areas for offerings, for basement, basically, even storing of beer, grain. you really want all the stuff that you enjoy during life. You want it in your afterlife, right? So, simple rectangular building, right? Like a one-story building. And there's going to be a false door, normally, a ka door, and we'll get to what that is later. It's an aspect of someone's individuality. And you have this false door. There's always going to be some way to make offerings. There's going to be grave goods, right? And, right, you've got your house. As someone who's wealthy, the Pharaoh, basically, right? So from this point on, until we transition to our second truth, we're really going to be looking more at what it means to be the Pharaoh and what happens with your burial, tomb, afterlife. So those are going to be the two different truths that we're focused on for today, because it's not exactly the same thing if you're the elite of the elite at the top and then everybody else. Right? So let's stick with looking at how things are for the Pharaoh. Okay? Second dynasty, you had the Mastabas. Now you get to this big jump that people are more familiar with. In the third dynasty, you have something called the step pyramid that will develop under the Pharaoh Djoser, possibly with the architect Imhotep being involved in this. And what you're doing, and I'll bring up some images, you're just stacking, if you think about it really, you're stacking one house on top of another, and sort of one-upping your predecessors, right? So you end up getting this early stage in the evolution of pyramid building where it's not a true pyramid yet, right? It's got all these different levels getting smaller as you go higher and higher on the pyramid, and there's going to be a bunch of lower levels as well, right? Place for the body, and place for grave goods. I mean, you have to understand that a pharaoh has a ton of stuff. they're rich, right? And they certainly don't want to have nothing there in their tomb. Which is why grave robbers, right, tomb robbers, love to try and break into all these royal tombs, and successfully did so for thousands of years because they were filled with just a ton of treasure, right? So that's the third dynasty, where you have Djoser and the step pyramid. This is a big shift, right? These are being built, by the way, in Saqqara. And they're not on the Giza plateau yet. It's not right outside of Cairo yet. Not super far away, but a different location. So this is where you have a lot of these early Old Kingdom tombs. It should be noted as well that there are actually other step pyramids. So the two kings after Djoser also start to build step pyramids. Oftentimes tombs aren't finished, whether it's a pyramid or a rock cut tomb in the Valley of the Kings or whatever. Someone might die, right? I mean, you get sick, you die, and the tomb that you wanted isn't ready. So it's either abandoned, used for something else, and you have to be placed somewhere else. So things like that are occurring a lot. But there are multiple step pyramids that did exist, is what I'm getting at. It's not until you get to Sneferu where you have the first true pyramid. And we're now also shifting into the fourth dynasty of the Old Kingdom period of ancient Egypt. Even trying to make the first true pyramid, you have the bent pyramid where things didn't quite go very well and it was sinking, and so they had to adjust and make it a little bit not as big, right? Shorter than they had originally planned for it. You've got what's known as the Red Pyramid, which is really the first sort of true pyramid shape. And then we're going to lead into the famous, right, Great Pyramid and pyramids, that are right out there on the Giza Plateau, that one of the ancient wonders, right, of the world, the only ancient wonder of the world that's still standing. And how do those differ, right? What was the deal? The first thing to understand that we haven't even looked at is that everyone's always like, the pyramids. How are they built? This, that. The pyramids are one component of a much larger apparatus that exists, a complex. That's what it is. It's this entire mortuary complex, of which the pyramid is one element. You have a mortuary temple, you have a larger enclosure wall, you have a causeway, like these like walkways possibly connecting to the Nile. You have pits for things like solar barks, right? These large boats, possibly full-size real boats that are buried. And we'll see why in a little bit. Then you're going to have valley temples. You're going to have smaller pyramids for the principal wives. Larger cemeteries surrounding this for noblemen. And domestic structures for workers. It's a huge, sprawling situation is what I'm getting at. It's not like kind of where you see today and you think, oh, it's just this one pyramid, right? And that's what it was. No, it was even more impressive than what you think of today. So when you do get to the Great Pyramids, right, and you've got the Pharaoh Khufu, Khafre, Menkaure, where they're the ones that have these largest pyramids that are unbelievably expensive, right, to build. To the degree that some scholars have suggested this is a major factor in economic decline when you get into like the Fifth Dynasty and beyond, from trying to pay, right, for all of these things to be built. I mean, the largest pyramid is essentially just shy of like 500 feet. And just try to think about the scale of that in the ancient world. Right? This video, we're not actually going to get into how did they build the pyramids. There are hundreds of videos on YouTube where you can hear about wild speculation, ranging from simple ramps, of course, which obviously are going to be used to some extent, to the highly, highly unlikely, right, alien sort of hypothesis. I think one little thing I will touch on relating to all this is that, like, notice I'm trying to highlight there's an evolution of pyramid building, right? Pit graves, a larger sort of a subterranean tomb, right? A subterranean tomb with a one-story building on top, then a multi-story building. And then it's pretty logical to fill in the sides once you've got a step pyramid, right? And make a true pyramid. Especially when, one piece I have not touched on yet, there's something called the Bin Bin stone, which relates to the sun god Ra and relates to the creation myth. The basis of the main, at least, creation myth, there are multiple in ancient Egypt, the Heliopolitan one, is that you have a mound of earth that sort of pushes up as waters of chaos recede, and it's in the shape of a pyramid. That's the beginning of what, like, sort of like the magic of the sun god starts everything with creation on this mound of earth. So the pyramid shape itself is extremely symbolic of regeneration and resurrection. So you cannot lose sight of that, especially the very top of the pyramid, which we don't have a lot of these. They're gone because they were probably made from precious metals. There's that factor. And imagine, though, when they were new and the sun comes and hits the very top of the pyramid, and if it's made out of an alloy of gold, silver, something like electrum, just the brilliance of the sun hitting that, okay, and the symbolism that's going to be involved in all of this, right? Which touch on that here pretty soon, okay? So one thing also that I want to highlight is like, okay, that's maybe what they kind of look like, the evolution of the pyramid building, but what's the purpose of all this? It's really to commemorate and recognize that the king is a god. The king has become a god. The king is immortal. The king has united with the divine family, with Osiris and with Ra. Okay? That's critical. And it's going to be a big difference between the king and all the rest of us. We unite, if we're lucky enough, with our actual family. If the proper rituals are done, and if we're good people, a concept, like we're justified, so we'll develop later, then we have hope as sort of like the average person, or at least a wealthy enough person, to reunite with your actual family. But the king is a unique figure and is basically united with the divine family. Okay? The king has something that's going to be called a royal ka, which is like a life force or double. In this case, it's kind of like the spirit of Horus, the god Horus, a god of order, that descends upon the king and stuff at coronation. And when the king dies, their royal ka, there's a separation, and there's always a risk of chaos, and a ton of things have to be done. So really, the pyramids, the whole mortuary complex, all of this is key, so that it's not even just about only the pharaoh, it's also about the continued order of Egyptian society on earth. Okay? Now, one last difference I want to also point out, in a lot of these, most of these old tombs for the king, you have something called a cenotaph, a term that you probably never heard before. This is almost like an empty tomb where it might have a statue in it, it might just be empty, but there's an area for the actual body of the deceased king, and then there's like a separate area for the spiritual essence of the king. So that's called a cenotaph, and we see those in most of the ancient burials. But you're not going to have that for even like a wealthy person. That's not a typical situation. So starting to see that there are some important differences between what the top guy gets and everybody else, right? Okay, so let's look a little deeper now at what happens after, and then that's where we'll stop for one side of things. We're going to look at what happens after the Great Pyramid in the Fourth Dynasty. When you enter the Fifth Dynasty, there's a massive shift again when it comes to the afterlife, burial practices. In the Fifth Dynasty, you have the pyramid texts that come about. These are the oldest religious scriptures, aside from maybe some magical text relating to Sumerian society, that we have in the world. They're certainly the most intact and complete ancient religious texts. They're easily got about 1,000 years on the Vedas in India. So very, very old. I mean, they go back to the Fifth Dynasty in ancient Egypt, but that's just when they're being written down. It's certain that they go way, way back earlier than even that. All right? Let's listen to a couple of these. All right? I've got a couple quotes for you from the pyramid text that would have been written inside on the walls, right? In the burial chambers, the antechamber of these tombs for the pharaohs in the 5th, 6th dynasties. So here's a quote. Atum, which is also like Ra. Atum, bring me up to you. Encircle me inside your arms. There is no star god without his companion. I am your companion. Then it continues on later in the text, talking about Unas, the Pharaoh that's deceased. You, Unas, will not perish. Your Ka will not perish. You are Ka. So that's from one of the earliest texts that we have of these examples of the pyramid text relating to the resurrection aspect with the deceased Pharaoh. Here's another. Hail, Eunice, you have not gone away dead. You have gone away alive. Sit on Osiris's chair with your baton in your arm and govern the living. Two names come up separately in these two quotes. You've got Ra or Atum, and then you've got Osiris. That's basically everything in this cycle relating to death, regeneration concept. If you really want to understand the pyramids, you really want to understand the afterlife beliefs for the ancient Egyptians, you have to look at the geography, like what's going on in the actual land around them. They've got one river, critical, the Nile, so that's going to be important, right? Then they've got the heavens up above them that is spectacular, right? At that time that you can see. So you need to place it within that sort of worldview. And the sun god, Ra, in this solar cycle and solar religion, it's very popular in the 4th and 5th dynasties. You want the deceased pharaoh to be taken up to the imperishable ones, right? To the gods and to the imperishable stars. So the pharaoh is to become a god and to become a star. You could look at it that way. Like the star Sirius, for example. They want to be connected to the stars of the northern sky that don't set beneath the horizon. The ones that are imperishable in that way. And as you go up into the sky, what's happening is, for one thing, the gods are primarily in the sky, but your mother, so in the Egyptian mythology, the goddess Nut is sort of spread across the sky, and you're basically going on this journey on a boat around, around. And half of it's during the day and half of it's at night, sort of thing. So as you kind of enter into the womb, right, you're going up into the sky, you're going back into the mother, you're being symbolically reborn. And if you look at the tomb structure itself for, like, say, the 5th dynasty, you've got a burial chamber, you've got an antechamber, and then offerings going from east to west, okay? And then you've got a long chamber that's going to lead out that's going to go south to north, where you're like climbing in an ascent. So it's like a double symbolic way of representing generation. You're going from like, the east, and where you've got the sarcophagus and the tomb, and then this whole process of like moving into the antechamber and becoming an effective spirit, and then kind of like moving out up into the sun. So there's all these different ways of which the Egyptians are going to try to symbolically, through art, through the architecture itself, and through text, help, rituals, help the deceased pharaoh be reborn and for order to be maintained, right? That's what they're aiming at. Okay? So that's one side of things. Looking more at what's happening with the Pharaoh. Okay? Let's flip it and look at some general things to do with Egypt, but also then what happens as time goes on beyond the Fifth and Sixth Dynasties, and what happens for everybody else, right, when they die. So in order to understand what's going to happen to everybody else, but this also relates to the Pharaoh, it's key to look at least 5 different components that make up an individual, a living thing for the ancient Egyptians. All right? So 5 aspects. Number 1, the Ka. The Ka is like your life essence, life force. It's also a double of you. So there's kind of this idea of there being like a double world when you go way, way back in ancient Egypt, right? And so when you die, you more or less want things to continue as the way that they were before. So you need to maintain the mummy, which we'll talk about later, but you need the body, you've got the Ka, this life essence, you've got the Ba, which is your personality, what we would understand as a soul today in the Western world. And those are the 2 most important. When the Ka and the Ba separate, that's when you're dead. It's sort of like a definition for death for the ancient Egyptians. And the goal will be, when you die, to bring those 2 things back together and become something called an Ak. That means an effective or radiant one. Someone who is deceased but still can have an impact on the world of the living. So you desperately want to achieve this goal of becoming an Ak. That will require money, a paying priest to be able to do funerary rites, and to provide offerings, continued offerings for your Ka, which, like your body, needs bread, drink, stuff to sustain it ongoing, right? But even spells can sustain it as well. So if you have text written on your tomb, that's relevant, because if I walk by your tomb and I read a standard offering formula that has your name, it's associated with you, which brings up another piece of what it is to be a person or to be an individual living thing, a name. You need to have a name. Your name contains something truly special and unique about who you are. And that goes for the gods as well, not just for people. Okay? So if I go by your tomb, I read this offering formula and it's got your name attached to it, then those offerings can sustain your Ka to some extent, even if it's not like real bread. Because the Ka doesn't actually consume. It's not like if you put bread out there at the tomb that it's just gone the next day. The Ka is taking the Ka of the bread, more or less, like the spiritual sustenance off of the offerings itself. Okay? So Ka, Ba, 2 most important. Then your name, Rin, right? And then beyond that, you have the heart, Ib. The heart is left in the body. Okay? The other organs are taken out during the mummification process. They're taken out and they're put in something called canopic jars. Those canopic jars are going to be sometimes put in a separate chest. Sometimes they're just in there in different parts of the tomb, and they're sort of protecting the organs. But you need to take the organs out of the body, because obviously that's going to lead to decay if you don't. And you want to pack it with natron, with salt, and desiccate the body as much as possible so that it doesn't decay. Right? You want to wrap the body in a bunch of linen wrappings. You want to have spells written on some of these wrappings. And you might not know this, but if you think about a mummy is not just a dead body wrapped up in linen wrappings. If you were to find a wealthy, especially someone really high up, and move their body, what's left of it, there's going to be amulets and things falling out of it. Lots of different amulets over different parts of the body, especially over the heart. It'd be a heart scarab with spells written on the back of it. So it's extremely complex what you'd have going on. And the heart is the seat of your emotion and your volition, like your will. It has elements of mind. It's sort of like a heart mind. The brain could be taken out violently after death. But the heart, you want to keep that in. So it just goes to show how important that is in terms of someone's individuality. Right? Now, that's 4 things I've mentioned relating to what makes like a living thing. There's also something called the shadow soul. That we're not going to get into because it's sort of not abundantly clear what exactly its functions are, and it just sort of takes us too far afield. I will say a little bit here that like literally your shadow is somehow an extension of you. So maybe you've heard of some ancient cultures where like walking through someone's shadow, especially a king, someone important, or a spiritual figure, it could be a bad thing. It could get you in trouble. Even in the Bible, stuff like this is mentioned. If like, getting in the shadow or something of an apostle or something like that. So it's an extension of you, which means you could affect someone else or they could affect you through magical means. It even relates to buildings like the Sphinx itself. If you were to be in the shadow of the Sphinx, you're somehow in its within its sphere of influence, I guess you might want to say. So there you have these 5 different components that make up a living thing. Very important in ancient Egypt. Okay? Now, we're going to need to see some stuff that's going to happen with some of these 5 elements. Right? Let's jump to the texts again. In the ancient world, we had the pyramid text. If you move on the timeline to what's called the Middle Kingdom period in ancient Egypt, there's going to be a slow shift where it's like everything's really about the Pharaoh and his becoming immortal. And now we shift to the wealthy governors, right? Government officials who are still important, close to the Pharaoh in some way. They have something called the Coffin Text, where you literally could write, if you got a coffin, you could put them in columns on the inside and outside for the deceased as a reminder, right? So it's not just for the Pharaoh anymore. The Coffin Text, in terms of like the content, if you read them, a lot of it is similar to the same of what you have on the pyramid text. So in many ways, it's an extension. But remember, for the average person, or even the wealthy government official, you're aiming at a recreation of your life in the afterlife. You're playing the same role as you did before, assuming things go well and you become an Akh, right, and become an effective one. You're probably dealing with administrative type things, and you're hoping to go hunting, fowling, right? And basically just enjoy the pleasures that you had while you were alive. It's not too surprising that that's what they would want. right? With immortality, an extension of the good times from when you're alive. Right? Now, there will be this concept that will continue to develop of like a court of justice, where you will be judged not necessarily early on about like your personal ethical behavior, but whether or not you're ritually pure in certain ways and that you've followed the rules in terms of order in society. It's not just though about personal ethics. So that will develop as time goes on to get us to this idea of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, or as it's really known as, the Egyptian Book of Going Forth by Day. Okay, that's its actual title. But Egyptian Book of the Dead just sounds, I don't know, right? More profound and shocking, mysterious to a lot of people. So, if things don't go well, even before the Egyptian Book of the Dead, there is a concern of that you will be taken over by demonic forces of some kind, that you would be forced to walk upside down, eat feces, and drink urine. Really unpleasant things that they came up with, right? And that idea extends as you get into the New Kingdom period. And when you get into more like around 1400, let's say 1300 BCE on our timeline, a lot of stuff has changed now at this point from the old ways, but you still have a connection going back from the Egyptian Book of the Dead to the Coffin Text to the Pyramid Text. There are some elements that are similar, like, you know, Ra and Osiris and things. They're still there and will be mentioned in this newer text. Now, we'll look at one aspect now of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. It's the most famous, I would say, of all. It's spell 125 from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Right? The part that you might hear is called the negative confession. That's basically where the deceased person is having to proclaim that, hey, I did not steal or, you know, do this various sexual activities I wasn't supposed to do, or, right? They're just rattling off a list of things that they didn't do, right? To prove that they're worthy of becoming one with Osiris or becoming an Ak, right? To be, technically the term is in Egyptian, Ma'at Keru, which means someone who's true of voice, justified. If this were a court case, right, it's like the person who won, right, the court case, who was telling the truth in the court case. So this idea of like a hall of justice or court of justice, you can pretty much see how that will develop into later concepts and religions when we get to Christianity especially, and this idea of a judgment that you'll get in Western monotheisms, also within Judaism, where you've got sort of Yahweh and the Elohim, and this sort of like court of heavenly attendants, different angels responsible for different regions of the world, and stuff like this. The Egyptians kind of have a precursor concept going on, especially because your responses are being recorded, and the god Thoth is involved, where god of writing, scribes, wisdom, he's writing down a lot of the things that you're saying, sort of like writing you into a book of life for those that are justified. So many important elements in this one spell, and the vignette, like the imagery that's normally going to be associated with spell 125. It's extremely important. But I want to read to you what's sort of at the intro level that you probably haven't heard from spell 125, the Book of the Dead. So it goes like this. Hail to you, great God, Lord of the two truths. I have come before you, my Lord, just so that you might bring me, so that I might see your beauty. I know you, and I know your name, and the names of the 42 gods who are with you in the hall of two truths. Which you can see how this has special relationship to me and this channel, since this channel is called Two Truths, right? It wasn't because of this, but it's a sort of interesting, right, correspondence here that comes up. The idea of two truths, as it relates here in this text, there's a lot of dualisms going on in ancient Egypt. You have what's called Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, right? You've got gods and goddesses and different crowns that go for Upper and Lower Egypt and stuff like that. Now, it's a pretty cool little intro. One thing that kind of stands out to me in this intro is where it states, I know you and I know your name and the names of the 42 gods, which is a reference to like 42 provinces in Egypt, in ancient Egypt at that time. So this is really important because to know a person's true name or a god's true name gives you some level of like maybe leverage, I guess, and authority in this. So an important line that in English in the 21st century you might not think much of that, but it kind of feels like a little bit of like, hey, I'm not a nobody. It's a little bit of a power play coming into this. And that kind of leads into the negative confession, that intro text that I just gave you there. Right? So what happens if things don't go well for you in that? If you're not Ma'akeru or this true voice, well, it isn't good. You can see the imagery that I've been bringing up here. You've got scales with your heart being weighed against a feather. Doesn't sound good to begin with if it was literal. But the symbolism here is basically who you are, your will and emotions versus truth, justice, cosmic order. That's what the feather stands for. Ma'at. It's a goddess. So you don't want to be heavy with sin, so to speak, or you're screwed. Effectively, like if you are a liar, right? They're going to know, and your heart might be devoured by Amit, this monstrous being that's sitting there next to the scales, and you have no existence. You basically die twice, which is annihilation. The worst sort of fate that could befall someone. So you want to be united with Osiris, of course. Right? That whole concept, as we've seen, goes all the way back to the Old Kingdom in the pyramid text. So it's a long run of this whole Osiris cult myth that it's not like it's just lasting for a couple hundred years. We're talking about thousands of years that this is going to have a major impact. Last but not least, what about the ritual of bringing a statue or a person back? The mummy or a statue, right? Well, pretty simple. It runs like this. It's called the opening of the mouth, right? And the way in which you do this is you would ceremonially place a little bit of like a, how do you call it, an adze, A-D-Z-E, where it's like a scraper or you chip away, right? This tool that's used to kind of cleave open the lips. Or in earlier texts too, you might use like a two-finger. There's like a two-finger amulet that you see a lot in ancient Egypt. The idea being like if you think about a baby, to clear the mouth, right? So it's not just an opening of the mouth, but it's this whole ritual process of being like regenerated, right, in a womb. And so they're doing a lot of those ritual actions and a ton of convoluted, complex spells that need to be stated over the body or over a statue or over a building. It's not just a person. You can like reanimate or animate what effectively is an inanimate object. That's very important to understand, because a various, like a god's ba or ka, there's permeability, right? It's not like it's just only in me, my personality. In some way you could do magic and you could take on some of my personality traits or aspects. A statue in the right shape or form can take on attributes of a person or of a god. Before a ritual is done in front of it, it's a statue, right? But if the proper ceremony has been done, you might be dealing with the god Horus or something, right? Himself, who is indwelling, on/in that statue, that cult statue, right? So that's the confusion. And this is going to be, if we were to sort of now step into other religions as we cap today's video, you could see the concern with idolatry as we get into something like the Hebrew Bible, right, and the Torah, because the common person doesn't make this theological or subtle distinction between, or metaphysical distinction between, right, that's just a statue of gold or stone or whatever, versus, oh, it's the God. It's, it isn't the God unless you've done the ritual. The Pharaoh is a human being in a sense, right? Like the rest of us. But if we go through this like Horus ceremony and coronation ceremony, where the falcon god comes down and sort of lands on him in a sense, and the Pharaoh takes on that royal ka, now he's effectively a living god. So he's kind of like two things at once. He's almost like a walking, talking cult statue in this way. So magic is everywhere in ancient Egypt, right? The sun god himself used his Heka, his magic in creation. So everything that's in the created world is imbued with magic, right? Which makes for a fascinating worldview. And I think in many ways that's why so many people love talking about ancient Egypt, because they live in an enchanted world, and sadly we find ourselves in a very disenchanted world. So that's it for today. As always, looking at two different sides of things. In this case, we're looking at the burial customs and afterlife in ancient Egypt. And I'll end the way I always end, since we can never know the truth fully. It's always best to stay gray.